Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is Tawseef Khan, and he's a solicitor from Manchester, specialises in immigration and human rights law, and he's written a fascinating book called The Muslim Problem, Why We're Wrong About Islam and Why It Matters. And Tawseef, I mean, it's a provocative title, but obviously what we're really getting to is that the Muslim problem isn't the Muslim problem, it's the British problem or the Western problem.
Absolutely. And I mean, in some ways, it is the Muslim problem because it's about talking and discussing how Muslim communities need to address the issues that we have. We need to be having the conversations that are taking place in wider society, but we need to be having them within our own community. So in some ways it is a Muslim problem, but in some ways it's not. It's the Western problem, or it's the problem. Because I always connect everything that's going on in the Muslim community to what is going on in wider society, for sure.
Over the last year, obviously, we've had huge conversations about race in Britain and America. And in all sorts of ways, there's been, there've been good conversations and it's made people think. And obviously there's a backlash, which we can talk about. But how part of that conversation have you felt, and how included have you felt? Has Black Lives Matter included Muslims?
Definitely. I mean, in America, in places like Minnesota, the Black Lives Matter movement was led by Black Muslims. So when we talk about the movement, it is very much led and pioneered by people who identify as Muslim as much as they identify as Black. But I think, and I think that in a place like America, the conversation around Black Lives Matter and Islamophobia is deeply entwined. But I think in a place like Britain, Islamophobia isn't really part of the conversation that we're having around race. Over the last few days, I've been thinking about how the media is interested in talking about Islamophobia as a spectacle. So it's comfortable with reporting on it, but not necessarily thinking about its complicity or its involvement or what we can do to actually have real conversations about changing the landscape when it comes to how Muslims are treated or perceived in Britain, for example.
You started writing this book after a terrible year, really, of attacks, which was 2017. And that included the Westminster attack, the London Bridge attack, and critically for you, the Manchester attack.
It was around this time of the Manchester attack that I felt compelled to do something and to write something. I was very aware the night that the Manchester attacks were on the news that this easily could have been me at the arena. I mean, I've been to that arena many, many times, but I almost went to that concert to see Ariana Grande. So it felt very, very real, very visceral. And I remember texting my friends that evening, and we were all, especially my Muslim friends, we were all just so bewildered, so freaked out and so afraid of what had happened, not just because this was something that was on our doorstep. As Mancunians, and as Mancunians of a certain age, it's easy to kind of disassociate yourself from what is happening in the capital. But now this was something that was on our doorstep. It could easily have happened to us. And that was something, completely different relationship to kind of the terrorist attacks that took place in Britain and elsewhere. But there was also a fear that we all had that this now changes everything for us. Our daily lives could change yet again. What it means to be a Muslim walking around on the streets, to be a visible Muslim in a place like Manchester is going to change. And we were all texting each other in fear of what that meant for our lives. What is going to happen in the days and weeks ahead? How are we going to be treated as we go about our daily business? And that was something that stayed with me.
Do you think it did change? I mean, I came up after that attack, and I mean, I'm from the Northwest, so I've sort of been up quite a lot since. And, one of the striking things about the initial reaction was that wasn't going to be the result of that attack, that Manchester wasn't going to turn in on itself and target Muslim communities. I mean, was that your experience, and do you think it lasted?
I definitely think that there was a huge amount of solidarity in Manchester in the days and weeks after the attack. There was a very distinct refusal to give in to the narratives that divided people that lived in the city and the region. But I think that as any time a terrorist attack happens, there is always the magnifying glass that is placed on the communities as we try to understand how this thing came to happen. How was it that Salman Abedi did what he did? I remember in those weeks coming home from work and learning that there had been raids on houses in areas near to me, or there was all of this questioning about the mosque that he went to, which is a mosque that I have been to I think only once, but it's one that I'm familiar with and I live maybe 10 minutes away from. But I was also very aware of the kind of grand narrative that was taking place and how the attacks in Manchester contributed to that. We were still then being kind of pulled into the cycle of questioning of why do Muslims not condemn terrorist violence? Why is this happening? Muslims are inherently violent. This is somehow down to the religion rather than, for example, political, social factors. So definitely I felt that whilst my personal experience was that I wasn't mistreated as a result of what had happened, the narrative in the country definitely took on a whole kind of additional force.
And this is your whole life, right? I mean, you describe yourself in the book as a child of the war on terror. How old are you?
34.
Ever since 9/11 in 2001, you know, to what extent do you feel your life has been framed by this? Absolutely framed by it. I was 14 years old when 9/11 happened. Prior to that, I was aware of being Muslim, but it was never a question in the same way. Of course, I had questions about what faith meant and what it meant to be a Muslim, and I resisted authority even at a young age in terms of what we were supposed to do in terms of prayers and so on. But I remember being 14 and being made to be aware of my religious identity in a way that I'd not been aware before. I had the luxury of growing up in a very kind of Muslim South Asian community. My primary school was 98% Asian. And so I never had the feeling of being an outsider at primary school. And even in high school, in the early years, it was a very kind of multi-ethnic, multi-religious community. So I never felt like an outsider. But I remember 9/11, the next day I went to school and we had to have this whole conversation with our teacher, with our form tutor about 9/11 and what had happened. And as 14 years old kids, we were expected to try and deconstruct what had happened. And I remember being asked by my teacher on that day, like, what do you think? And I had no answer, but I also felt very distinctly that I was being made to answer for, in some way, what had happened. And I don't think that was his intention, but I suddenly became aware of my the idea of complicity in what had happened, which was an incredibly frightening thought. And so I feel that from that moment, I became aware of what it was to be a Muslim and to be an outsider as a Muslim in this country, and then to have your identity and your faith and the tenets of those things constantly picked at and turned over in the media. And so I always talk about this idea that, I internalized everything that the war on terror said about Muslims. They say that we're violent, I believe them. They say that we don't integrate, I believe them. They say that we're homophobic and transphobic and, misogynist and so on. And I believed all of it. And it took me a really long time to find the words and the knowledge to unpick that stuff. As a teenager then, you were finding yourself being anti-Muslim?
I found myself feeling frustrated with the Muslim community. I found myself receiving the anger that I felt in the media and amongst politicians and redirecting it to the community that I was a part of and to Muslim societies and to Muslim countries. Definitely. There was a discomfort with being Muslim. So I talk about in the book how I was even uncomfortable saying salam to anybody who I encountered in the Muslim community. There was a period in my teenage years where I kind of drifted in that, yes, to some extent, because I had to, I practiced Islam. So I went to Saudi Arabia on pilgrimage, I fasted. When I was forced to, I prayed. But there was definitely a psychological split between the stuff that I was doing and what I was feeling. And for a long time, I talk about being pagan. I went into school and I said to my friends, like, I don't believe in this stuff anymore. I'm gonna hug trees and I'm going to think about my connection to nature than God. And I think about being very angry with God and actually like having conversations saying like, I'm really pissed off with you and I just want you to know that.
When you talk about when you had to pray or when you were forced to, and that is instantly quite an alien concept for a lot of us, even for me, coming from a pretty wishy-washy Hindu background, the idea of being forced to do anything is not really part of my experience. And certainly, in the Church of England, the idea of being forced into anything is pretty alien. So, I mean, just explain what you mean by that and how different that makes, your upbringing as a Muslim.
I mean, I think that in some religious communities, there is a sense of compulsion that is enacted by religious gatekeepers. And so in my upbringing, my first religious gatekeepers were my parents, my mum especially. So there was a huge desire that when I was of age, so when I was about 12 years old, that I had to start praying 5 times a day. And so there was a constant kind of mithering and pushing to, well, have you done, Fajr, have you done this? And if I tried to avoid it, I would for example, I would go to bed, try and avoid doing the nighttime prayer. My mum would wake me up and be like, no, go to the bathroom, go and wash, go and do your prayers. And I was very, very resentful of that, even from a very young age. So I remember being 8 years old and being told off for praying incorrectly, and I felt really humiliated because it was done in front of my cousin, and I knew that there's an issue that I have with religion now that carried through. And so yes, there is an element of compulsion that is often placed on Muslims with when it comes to practicing certain tenets of their faith. Nowadays, now that I'm the age that I am, I feel empathetic towards my parents about this. I feel I can locate this in a desire for my parents to make sure that I had a very strong cultural and religious identity in a place where not only is there not a lot of time for God, but there's, we live in a community that isn't, we don't live in a Muslim majority society. So there's always this fear of losing yourself. And I know that my parents now don't do any of that. One, because I'm 34 years old, but two, because they understand that I have a very, very strong sense of self. So I can empathize with that. But it was still really important for me to write this book and acknowledge that the other part of the matrix that Muslims find themselves in is the religious gatekeeping and the religious dogma, where religion is something that you don't necessarily think about. Religion is something that you are not allowed to question. There is only a singular interpretation of Islam and of the Quran. There is no multiplicity of relationships that you can have with the faith. You are constantly being told what is permissible and what isn't permissible. And any attempt to develop a relationship with Islam that is organic and authentic to you is suppressed.
I mean, so you're describing a life in which everybody from your parents and your community is telling you what being a Muslim means, and everybody who basically knows nothing about it in the media and politics and your non-Muslim friends are also telling you what it is to be a Muslim and what that means.
Absolutely. And that's why I had to write the book the way that I did, but also title it the way that we did, which is that, why we're wrong, because I truly believe that the majority of us are wrong about Islam. And it matters because it matters for the way that Muslims are able to develop relationships with Islam and with faith and spirituality that is authentic to them. It's an incredibly frustrating experience to constantly feel that your faith is defined for you by external actors. Whether that's within the community or whether that's externally.
You talk a lot about Islamophobia. Just explain what you mean by that.
I think that Islamophobia is about the negative perception of Muslims and Muslim communities and the faith. I think that Islamophobia is the appropriate term because it reduces Muslims to a homogenous community, it racializes us as a single community. So even though we are all from different communities and backgrounds and races and so on, and we have different relationships with the faith and we belong to different sects, there is this kind of like grouping together of Muslims as a singular. All Islamophobia is rooted in very, very basic, almost medieval stereotypes. The idea of violence, the idea of foreignness, the idea of misogyny, the idea that, our values are not compatible, the idea that masculinity in Islam is, or Muslim masculinity in particular, is a problem. So for me, Islamophobia is a very distinct concept that is an offshoot of our understanding of racism. And I understand that many people feel like Islamophobia is not a thing. But I think that if you look at the way that Islamophobia operates, if you look at it as something that has structural and institutional limbs, if you look at it the way that it's shaped by institutions that have power, but also in everyday attitudes, you would understand that Islamophobia isn't something that can be so easily dismissed.
The book is sort of a mixture of sort of your experience and that of other people. But what it seems to be doing is also saying, that the presentation, if you like, or discrimination and hatred of Muslims is constantly presented as a rational thing.
Absolutely, and it definitely is. And I think that it's very hard to argue with when people look and see what might be evidence of those things being true. So, for example, to posit that Muslims are inherently misogynist, and then to see ways in which our communities haven't moved as forward as we could on gender inclusion and gender equality, there are definitely people feeling that there is something to it. We need to understand why the commentary about Muslims is like a running theme in the media. Why are we constantly talking about Muslims when they are such a small proportion of the kind of population in Britain, and why are we so obsessed with the Muslim question, the Muslim problem? When we start to interrogate the question of why, what is the purpose, we understand that this is not rational, and the constant magnifying glass that is placed on Muslims isn't really about changing the material conditions of Muslims, whether it is the material conditions of women. These are just ways in which those in power can exploit situations in Muslim communities for the goal of dehumanizing Muslims and presenting them as other and foreign.
Why would that be a goal?
That's a difficult question, but I think that it's useful because it is always useful for those in power to have an enemy, to have somebody who can be whom we can concentrate all of our frustration and blame and scapegoating on. And I think that as we see in Western society, the scapegoat that it has evolved and changed. And I think that we are in an era where Muslims are a convenient scapegoat. So, for example, we can blame a lot of our economic and social woes in Britain on Muslim migration and Muslims failing to do this and Muslims failing to do that. A lot of our conversations about immigration, Europe accepted, are actually about black and brown people. They're actually about Muslims. They're a byword for us talking about Muslims. And I think that it's easy for us to use Islam as a way of not only blaming and distracting from the real issues that we face in Britain, but also abroad they are a way for justifying kind of aggressive foreign policies. You begin with the question of integration. And it's a hoary old chestnut. Muslims keep themselves to themselves. They all live together, as if everybody chooses that, and they don't want anything to do with us. I mean, this is something that we see repeated over and over again, and it's presented in so many different ways. If we look at the Bertelsmann Foundation assessment into how integrated Muslim communities are in 5 European countries, we find that on the whole, overwhelmingly, Muslims are integrated. If we look at education, language, employment, social and emotional connections to the countries that they live in, Muslim integration is high, and it's increasing with every generation. If Muslims do not integrate, there are economic factors, there is discrimination, there are institutional issues that are preventing Muslims from, improving their integration in societies that they live in. And that often is about, for example, discrimination in the workplace, or discrimination in kind of the educational system, or discrimination in the housing system. It's very difficult for people who are, dispossessed in many ways economically to create the life that people want to manifest for them.
But it's also to do with what is integration, isn't it?
Absolutely. And so that's the thing I talk about in the book. What is integration? For me, integration isn't the process whereby people from the outside adapt and change themselves for people already living here. Integration is a two-way process. It's about us trying to think about what it entails to create a harmonious society. And actually, I think that the mass failing of the conversation around integration in Britain is that we don't really have a non-controversial way of understanding this. Our understanding of integration is very much framed by the tabloids. So instead of thinking about like a place like Germany or a place like Australia, they have integration policies. So they're really thinking about, well, what will it entail for newcomers to this country to be a proper part of it. That involves the government playing their part. It involves the people already living here playing their part, but it also then involves the people who are coming to play their part.
I noticed that you mentioned both Germany and Australia in the book, and I did wonder, you mentioned them very briefly, but you've got to be very careful, haven't you, in holding them up as examples?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that I talk about, for example, the issues that Germany has with the education system. It has an education system that seems to disadvantage children from Muslim communities, because at a very young age, children are sorted according to ability, and that ability is often defined, racially and in terms of, linguistic ability and so on. So definitely I don't hold them up as like paragons of doing integration well. But I think that there are examples that we should be taking on. When we talk about integration, are we really talking about integration, or are we talking about assimilation? Are we talking about the erasure of Black and brown communities and everything that they hold dear in order to be accepted? Because if that's true, the reality is that those people can never be accepted. I can never be accepted in Britain, even if I erase or everything, even if I start drinking and eating pork and going to the pub every weekend, because I still have brown skin. Against a white background, I am still a brown body.
And against that background of discrimination, that is also partly why holding on to religious and national culture becomes more important to immigrant communities often.
My parents are a great example of this. When I started finishing the book and I started having these conversations with them, I realized so much about how my parents' lives in Britain have been framed by a fear of white violence. Especially my mum, who came in the 70s when the neo-Nazis were, still patrolling the streets. My life has very much been, and my upbringing has been framed by the fear that they had of wanton violence on the streets. That fear has not gone away. And so the way in which they've been able to try and reconcile the violence is to make sure that we have a very, very strong sense of who we are as people with Pakistani origin, but also with Muslim heritage. It's a way of claiming dignity in a society that often, believes that everything that you are, there is no inherent dignity in that.
But isn't there a problem from both sides, though, as well, in that, there are also people in your community, my community, whatever it might be, who genuinely think their culture is better. And so just as you have the right in Britain who will say you've got to ditch everything, play cricket, drink beer, and imagine yourself, in a green field in Surrey. There are, plenty of people in Muslim communities in Britain who also genuinely think that their culture, values, morality are superior.
That's definitely true. And I've been witness to those conversations in my extended family, conversations where people are incredibly dismissive of the society that we live in. And it's a very frustrating experience for me because, though I don't believe in nationalism, I'm pleased to live in this country, and I do feel a part of this country. I feel very strongly about the upbringing that I've had in Manchester. I think that often we need to think with more nuance and with more time and patience as to where these impulses come from. I feel like often maybe there is a little more desire to understand where, for example, sentiments in the far right come from, but we can't understand or give time to the insecurities that are responsible for the supremacy that can exist in, for example, minority communities, including the Muslim community. I think that we are incredibly defensive because of the history that we are, have been subject to. We have been witness to and are still witness to the constant framing of Muslims and Muslim societies and Muslim cultures and Muslim faith as negative, as insufficient. And so the response to that is obviously to say, well, we're not deficient, you're deficient. We're not the ones who are less than, you're less than.
You have a lot of examples in the book about, well, Islam, allows for this, Islam allowed for that historically, the current caricatures of what Islam might think about women or gay people or whatever other issue you want to take on, is not, written for everybody in Islam. Does it matter? Is the trouble that you can put an enlightened interpretation on things if other people have something totally different?
Let me begin by saying absolutely the book is my interpretation. It is my presentation of Islam, and I am unapologetic about that because, as Amina Wadud says at the end of the book, Amina Wadud being a fantastic Black American scholar of Islam, that we all individually construct Islam for ourselves. We decide what Islam is before we speak about it, before we live it, before we practice it. And so I'm very much doing the same. This is my construction, my understanding of Islam, and it is framed by my journey with Islam as a young person, feeling that there was no place for me in it, feeling alienated by the stereotypes that I talk about, and trying to find a way to be Muslim and to uphold the values that are really important to me. So I think that that's definitely the case. But I think that this is also important because on the one hand, in Muslim communities, we have this desire to sweep away our history and the complexity of Islamic thought and Islamic societies. I think that's definitely taking place, and that is fueled by a country like Saudi Arabia, which upholds a very singular idea of Islam. And I've witnessed, for example, and I speak about this in the book, members of my own family, we come from a very kind of like Sufi leaning, sort of lefty liberal understanding of Islam, and they have moved towards the Salafi Wahhabi, very rigid, very uncompromising, very dismissive concept of Islam.
Why?
Because I think that it's attractive. I think that certainty is attractive in a time when in a time when actually the world is incredibly unstable. Globalization has made things very unstable. So it is very attractive to embrace a tradition that promises you that this is framed in what the Prophet believed, what the people surrounding him believed. This offers you certainty. It tells you that if you do this, you will get to heaven in this way. And it's incredibly attractive to feel that you are right and everybody else is wrong. And I think that this stuff is important also because there are so many of us who don't have access to this knowledge. So, for example, being a young person, I always thought that Islam condemns homosexuality, and it was only until I was in my 20s that I got to have access to some of the thinking and some of the history and some of the knowledge that existed, and I wanted to. That changed my thinking, changed my relationship with Islam. It made me understand that that framing Islam as a homophobic religion is my choice, and I don't have to choose that because there is so much in the pantheon of our history and the pantheon of our scripture to believe otherwise. It's the same with the idea of misogyny. There is so much there for me to believe otherwise and to understand misogyny as something that was injected by the patriarchy rather than something that was endemic within the text.
But don't we also have to just look at how Islam is practiced in huge numbers of places? So, you may be able to work out that Islam is not a homophobic religion. But for huge numbers of Muslims living in the world, in all sorts of Muslim countries and communities, it is. And by overwhelmingly, the majority of those places it is, surely.
Yeah, and this is not lost on me. So much of my activist work has been focused on working with LGBT Muslims. I've helped, for example, an LGBT Muslim person from Yemen get asylum in Sweden. When I was doing this stuff, I would get messages from everywhere. I'm very, very aware that, for example, even to talk about Islam and sexuality in this way is a privilege, right? It's a privilege afforded of living in Britain, and I think that we need to be able to understand these things in tandem. So when I write the chapter in the book about Islam and homosexuality, I acknowledge fully the way that Muslim societies are thinking about homosexuality overall. There. I think the countries that impose the death penalty tend to be Muslim countries. The majority of countries that still have the criminalization of homosexuality are Muslim countries. This is very much a reality, and I'm also saying that the reality, the consequence of this reality is that to be LGBT and Muslim and live in a Muslim country is a particular harshness that results in many of those people choosing not to have any relationship with the faith at all. And that's a huge shame. On Judgment Day, we are all going to be asked of what we did and what we were complicit in, and the exclusion of a vulnerable minority is not consistent with our faith. If the Prophet practiced and preached consistently an embracing of an installation of minorities, how can we stand by and allow this to happen? When I was younger and I was doing the activist work, a question I often got asked was, it must be very, very difficult for the people that you're working with to be LGBT and Muslim. This must be their test. If life is a test for Muslims, this is their really, really difficult test. And I always reframed the question to say that actually I think the test is everybody else's. How can you uphold the rights, the justice that LGBT Muslims deserve? That is your test, not theirs. Although Muslim societies condemn LGBT Muslims on the whole, that is definitely a reality. It's also important for me to say that that's not a blanket reality. For example, in Pakistan is incredibly progressive on trans rights. It is one of the few countries that recognizes third gender status for people who are Khwaja Sarau, and live outside the gender binary. So in Pakistan, you can have on your ID documents that you're male, you're female, you're third gender, or you're nothing. But there are also imams who are talking about, we cannot discriminate against transgender people. We must, ensure that they have their rights. We must make sure that, that they also have access to the rights that they deserve as Muslims. So that's an incredibly progressive conversation, and it's so progressive that it's not actually mirrored in Britain. It's interesting that the government here has decided to have cop out from the kind of gender reform work that they were doing when a country like Pakistan, which in some parts does have the death penalty for LGBT people, can also then simultaneously have this kind of progressivism. The research that was done by the Aziz Foundation found that fewer people are opposed to homosexuality now than they were 20 years ago, and the people who are most progressive, most inclusive are younger people. So the tide is changing in Muslim communities. Not only does it break the idea of blanket homophobia and transphobia, but also it provides hope to young Muslims who might be LGBT and who can see that there is no reason to abandon your faith or your identity, and there is no reason to believe that everybody will reject you. There are spaces in Britain and in other countries that are LGBT affirming and Muslim.
It takes us really to sort of the heart of the tension, if you like, around what you're saying, which is, do you think Muslims in Britain are collectively punished for all the extremes on all the issues of your religion? And what is therefore your relationship with those people? I don't just mean terrorists. I mean people who do want to, who support the death penalty for being gay, or do think women's place is in the home, and all of those sorts of things.
That's a very difficult question. I think that definitely I agree with you. The theorist Albert Memmi talks about the mark of the plural. What is done by the majority is used as being representative of the majority. So the minority speaks for the majority. That is always the case when it comes to Muslim communities, as it is the case for other minority communities. Minority communities are always judged by what the minority do. The question of how to relate to people who believe in ideas that oppose yours, so it's a very difficult one, and I'm not sure I've completely figured that out. I try to believe in a coexistence, and I also try to believe that in the kind of like in the work of time. Time will change people. Time will also, I mean, often, for example, we talk about the battle for the soul of Islam and the feeling that we as Muslims are, we who are inclusive Muslims are in the minority. But I think that that's not always the case. I think that it's really important for us to speak more and more about what we believe in so that people understand there are more of us than we think, and so that we can directly challenge those who believe in, let's say, oppressive understandings of the faith. So as much as I coexist with those people, I also exist to challenge them and to tell them that there can be no Islam that oppresses other people, or at least not an Islam that I recognize.
What I mean is, do you spend your life looking at those things and being asked to account for them or explain them or condemn them, thinking, that's just got nothing to do with me? You know, yes, I'm a Muslim and they are Muslims, but what they think and believe and how they behave has got nothing to do with my life.
Absolutely. I mean, it has nothing to do with the way that I live. There's no doubt about that. Often I talk about feeling like that I live in a bubble, you know, and it feels very insulated from the way that other Muslims live their lives. And I know, I'm aware that that's a privilege. You know, I'm a solicitor. I live a very middle class life. I am insulated from a lot of the hardships that Muslims in Britain deal with. I don't have to, confront the way that Muslims live their lives or the things that they choose to believe on a daily basis. But I don't think that I'm in a place where I feel like I can completely remove myself from those people, or remove myself from people who believe those things, because I'm still living in a society and in where newspapers constantly use those people to tar us all. And I have empathy still for people who don't share my beliefs. I wish that I didn't have the responsibility, or I wish that I wasn't expected always to explain or to condemn or to speak about them, and I was only responsible for myself. I also feel this responsibility to speak for and about other Muslims, even though I'm not a representative for other Muslims, but I feel the responsibility to complicate the way that Muslims are understood in Britain, because we are understood in such singular terms.
You got a pretty harsh review, didn't you, in the Times from Ed Hussein,
Yes.
who basically accused you of being in denial and of ignoring the facts about terrorism in Britain.
Yeah.
What did you make of that?
Well, I didn't read the entire review because
You gave up halfway.
I heard about it and I read the beginning, but I wasn't going to pay for it. And I don't think that the review deserves so much of my time. When I heard about it and I read the beginning, for me, it was hurtful, but there was an element of non-surprise in that I felt like there could have been no other instance. There could have been no other conclusion for the Times, for a newspaper like the Times to write something that completely denied everything that I was talking about. You know, the Times, which has pioneered so much of the contemporary Islamophobia in Britain and has broken many of the Islamophobic stories that have kind of really captured my imagination in Britain. They could never have written a review that affirms the logic and kind of, you know, the common sense of my book. They could never have acknowledged that Islamophobia is real and that they are part of it. You know, that kind of like level of self-reflection was never going to happen.
Do you think you're allowed to criticise Britain?
No, I'm never allowed. And I mean, I'm lucky in that nobody really knows me. So, you know, the book has mostly, aside from that review, gone unnoticed. So I haven't gotten the kind of abuse that people of colour get in Britain when they talk about the nation. The things that I observe in British society and on Twitter, for example, is that anybody who speaks about the nation or critiques the nation or critiques Britain's present and its past is told that, well, you don't belong here, you know, and if you don't like it, you can go home. I'm not going anywhere, you know. I'm not going anywhere. I don't feel that I have to go anywhere. I belong here, absolutely. If I ever leave, it will be absolutely my choice and nobody else's. But I do believe that I have the right to critique Britain because I belong to it and because I believe in this society, and I believe in wanting British society to be as best and as good and as hopeful and as cohesive as it can be.
I mean, having explained why you wrote this book and the attitudes you wanted to change, what do you want the reaction to be?
I mean, I would like to change the material conditions for Muslims in Britain and in the West. I would like for us to have a more nuanced and reflective conversation about Muslim communities that isn't always about demeaning us and showing us as a nefarious, kind of part of Britain. If I wanted this book to change anything more broadly, it is that I would like for people to be way more reflective and self-critical than we are currently. And so by that, I mean, I wish we were way more engaged in the idea of critiquing and thinking about and questioning the narratives that are presented to us and that often we accept wholesale. We often take things uncritically rather than questioning where do they come from, what is the purpose of them, why am I asked to believe this? And I think that exists in all communities. So wider society about Muslims, but also within Muslim communities, we're often made to accept narratives that unquestioningly and uncritically.
Did you write the book really aimed at white people and end up writing a book that is really pointing at Muslims?
No. I wrote there was a whole separate set of politics that informed the book. And those were that as a brown person, I want to communicate first and foremost to the community that I belong to. When I was thinking about the book and when I started writing it, I was, at least the proposal, I was going into Waterstones nearly every day and I was looking at the section on history and politics, and nearly every book that was there was written about Muslims or about Islam was written by white people. And so I wanted to write something as a brown Muslim for other Muslims and claim space in the publishing industry and on the bookshelves, that here I am as a Muslim writing to and for other Muslims primarily. Yes, I'm speaking to white people as well. I think it's really important that they read the book.
And finally, I mean, if you could change the world anyway, what would you do?
Obviously, I want world peace. But aside from that, I would like people to be more self-reflective. I want us to start thinking, for me, with my own journey in terms of like social justice and so on, I've always, I wasn't somebody who was born with progressive and inclusive views on everything. It's something that I've had to learn and work at. And the question has always been to me that when you realize that there are people who are oppressed or disadvantaged or discriminated against, and somehow your views are contributing to that, or you are somehow complicit in that and believing that that is justified, it's an incredibly shameful perspective and it's an incredibly shameful position to hold. And the first time that I understood, for example, that as a man I was complicit in the patriarchy and the way that women are treated and perceived and the roles that they are often forced to occupy, that was an incredibly shameful moment for me and a liberating moment to move myself away from that and to say to myself consciously that I want to ally myself with the empowerment of women, and I want to remove whatever blocks that exist in my thinking that inhibit the empowerment of women, and that begins with, for example, the women that I've worked with, or the women in my community, or the women in my family. And I don't believe that I'm there in terms of like being this amazing feminist, but I'm saying that I'm allied to doing what is necessary and doing the work that is necessary to be that ally. And it's an incredibly liberating feeling for me. And it's the same, for example, with the Black community as well. As a brown person, of course, I'm not racist, right? Because I live in a society that is racist and I have often internalized racism towards Black people. But I am saying that I ally myself with the Black community and want to do the learning that it takes to be better at that. And it's liberating for me to do that work and to understand the ways in which I have unconsciously imbibed thinking and attitudes that constrain and are dismissive of or discriminatory towards the Black community. I would encourage people to do that work as well. It's painful, it's uncomfortable, but it's incredibly liberating to feel that you are shedding prejudice.
Tawseef Khan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for sharing your ways to change the world, and I hope you enjoyed listening to that. If you did, then please do give us a rating or a review so other people can find the podcast. And you can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel if you haven't already discovered it. Until next time, bye-bye.